All right. So with the book, now that it's published, it's been this long process for you. It's been 10 plus years, like 8 years or so working on this. What is your hopes that or outcomes from now that this book is published and it's people have access to it, finally seeing all your work into completed?
I mean, I don't have any grand hopes for the book. I don't think it's going to change the world or anything like that. But what I do hope is first and foremost that the stories and the histories that these Indigenous elders and these knowledge holders and community members are shared with me. I hope they get the attention, and we're trying to do that as much as possible, and doing some community events where they'll be present and they'll be with me the whole time. And so I think that's really important to see their knowledge and see the community's knowledge and just how powerful and incredible these communities are and resilient of everything that we've gone through as Indigenous peoples. To see that. The other thing that I kind of hope, and it was kind of a motive of mine, a political motive, I guess, throughout the work, is I wanted to create I'm really inspired by Leanne Simpson's work, and to create a resurgent history. What I mean by that is a history of Indigenous peoples, a kind of to help spread and promote a history of Indigenous peoples that can contribute in some small way to the resurgence of our communities, to the resurgence of our political institutions, of our governance, and ultimately of Indigenous history, that we see we're building a fire. And I think that's really important. I think that's important because I just want to see, again, in some small way that hopefully, Indigenous youth will take this. And do it better, and do a different story, or cover the story in greater detail, or re-empower themselves, their communities, their identities, through something like this. Like, it was such an important process for my own identity and connecting with my community and connecting with other Indigenous communities. I've been so lucky to, be grounded now and comfortable and really assertive in who I am as a Dekalth person from Nikaslii-Wet'en in the Lusulu clan. But then to learn from other Indigenous nations, it's been incredible. So I hope maybe one day Indigenous youth, they pick up this book, they see it in the library or something, and they say, this is pretty cool. I can do it better. I can do a different story, and kind of contribute to that resurgence that I'm talking about, and that Leanne Simpson talks about a great deal.
So talking back on the idea, you brought the idea of resurgence in Indigenous culture, whether it be ceremony, identity, language, revitalization, being the alluring topic of truth and reconciliation. Right. How does that resurgence play into that? Or so when it comes to the idea of reconciliation, I think I do think we're at a critical shift. I think we're at a critical point in time where there is a critical consciousness among Canadians and the Canadian public about the history of residential schools and about what our Indigenous community members went through. So, for instance, this is directly tied to my family, with my grandmother going to LeJac when she was a little kid, and for several years. And I have other family members that went to a residential school, and it's had a devastating legacy, a legacy that my family's going to struggle with well beyond my years. And we do the best we can to kind of meet that legacy and to stop it. But I think that, so bringing light to all of these things is really significant and really important. I think that's what was so important about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. When it comes to the way in which reconciliation itself is kind of constructed, particularly within the Canadian discourse and the Canadian government, I tend to disengage in that. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in engaging in reconciliation as saying that, we can quickly just kind of see our past wrongdoings when it comes to residential schools, apologize for it and move on. Because for me and my family, that reconciliation process is a lot longer than just simply doing that in the short term. And what I think is so important about the process is that, and why I'm not really going to engage in that, is because what I want to focus on is, rather than focusing on the outside of Indigenous communities, focusing on the mending of relationships and all of this stuff that I hope comes to fruition and does justice to all the injustice that was done towards Indigenous peoples in those residential schools and in day schools and public education systems, is that we also need to, as Leanne Simpson says, we need to build this fire of Indigenous resurgence. We need to focus, I like to contribute and focus on the Indigenous inside. That is to help with the resurgence of these Indigenous political systems, Indigenous governance, Indigenous nationhood, Indigenous identities, to a point that we see the self-determination of Indigenous people, and whether it be in their identities or in their ceremonies or in their political governance or in their legal systems, that they are unencumbered, that they're not being stopped from living freely as Indigenous peoples. And we're not there yet. I think we're generations from it still. That does not mean that it discounts any of the work that's been done or is being done. But I think that we're all part of this process of trying to build things up. And that's what I focus on. So that's why I'm engaging with Indigenous youth outside of the academy. So engaging with Indigenous youth and trying to play just a small, tiny little role in this resurgence of Indigenous culture, ceremonies, languages, political governance, and ultimately self-determination.
We talked about that too, just kind of on that subject, that resurgence, or even that finding that Indigenous identity. This is going to kind of just talk about, even for me, like, I don't know how to word it, but it's that idea of, like, it's not even how did you word it, but it's reconciliation isn't for, you don't care about the outside factors, and it's more of like an internal thing. And for me, I didn't grow up with our culture, because the same thing, like both my mother herself attended residential school and then went to day school. My grandparents on my father's side did, and there's things like, my mother can speak Blackfoot, she can speak it fluently, but it's things like she was the last sibling to go, but then all the other siblings in her family didn't go. They attended day school, but then none of them can speak the language. Or my father saying he remembers growing up and his parents and then their siblings would be speaking in Oneida, and as soon as the kids would walk in, they'd stop speaking and start speaking in English. And I never understood that connection to the culture and language, and it wasn't until, like, I kind of did a bit, right? And for me, it was this past weekend, I emceed an event, and we had it in the Longhouse. And I got reconnected with my, like, Oneida side in terms of, like, I met with the clan mothers, and they were just so welcoming, right? And at first they were like wondering, like, I had one clan mother who was like, "Hey boy, come over here, like, come." And the first question is like, "Who's your family? Like, whose kid are you?" And I said, like, Roy Kennedy, and they don't know him. Then I'd be like, Agnes and Wellington. And just when I said that, like, their eyes like lit up in terms of like, oh, like, because they knew who they were. And even this weekend, like, so it's a very matriarchal system. Like, our clan system is matriarchal. Mm-hmm. But my mother, for whatever reason, I don't know if they have a clan system out west, because that's part of my identity too, is trying to explore two different complete sides. I got Haudenosaunee, Oneida, and then I got Blackfoot, and I have to explore them. But for right now, it's just trying to focus on the Oneida. And that's the thing, is identity is like a life journey. But this weekend, essentially, I was given a clan by the clan mother, saying, like, well, when you come here, you'll be Wolf Clan, you'll be in my clan, because they're the adopting clan. And I guess for me, it was just that maybe it's just the start of having that, reclaiming my identity in terms of our traditions and our ceremonies. And I think part of it is, like, I don't think I may ever know the language. Like, I will do my best to know the language, but I know my children, like, I want them to know the language, and I will put them in immersion programs, because I think that's part of it's like the idea of like the 7 generations, right? Where everyone, something happens 7 generations, so it affects 7 generations. But then also the same thing works is that I'm being affected by what happened 7 generations ago, but I also am responsible and I can change the next 7 too. And so for me, it's like that idea is like, I want to change the next 7, and I'm going to start by making sure my kids know the language. And I know there's always that fear of like, we're losing the language, but I think we're becoming so much more aware that the fear, there is that fear there, but also maybe also that fear is also put in us more awareness, I guess, in terms of us being cautious of like, oh, we need to do something to ensure that it isn't lost. Right. And so for you, how is that like you reclaiming your identity, or what do you see for, you know, we say we're generations away of what that self-determination or where it could be, but for you, what is your vision for your personal history or your family's, future family's personal history in terms of...
Yeah, you're going to cause an existential crisis for me if I start thinking about this stuff. But that's ultimately what I hope is that we're only here, you know, we're only here because of the work that was done before us, right? And to be able to be whatever role we are in, whether it be in universities or trying to reinstill this stuff or play a part in it, to make mistakes. We're here because of those that fought for us to be able to do this. I think of, you know, I never met my grandmother, and you know, thanks to the residential school experience, it played directly into the reason why I couldn't ever meet her. And she was fluent in Decalth, and yet I don't know my language. And so this comes back to there really is no reconciliation for me. I don't get that stuff back. I mean, I can get back to my my language and my culture and my ceremonies, but I don't get my grandmother back. And I'm conscious of that every day. I'm conscious of it every day that I do not speak Decalth. And so going forward, what I hope is just to support the systems that will enable these things to thrive, and to see the great work. I mean, there's great work being done. Don't kid yourself. I don't want anybody to... I think at times we get so caught up in what do we do, what do we do, what do we do? And I get this a lot in my classes, and I have amazing students, and but we get caught up in this, what do we do, what do we do? And we don't stop to recognize the amazing stuff that's being done. Yeah. And so I think of the work of like a person that has a huge, huge influence on me, or a couple of people, has been Billy Ray Belcourt and Erica Violet Lee. And I just give them a shout out because here kind of these amazing, they have already arrived. I'm not even going to call them rising stars. But they're these youth advocates, these amazing people that are really making a positive difference in our world. And to see these Indigenous youth like doing these kind of projects, whether they're writing on blogs or they're writing poetry, they're publishing their poetry, they're doing amazing things. I think of, I just heard a great podcast on the Rematriate initiative, where it's reinstilling like matriarchal societies, putting emphasis on that, and Indigenous feminism, and placing an emphasis on Two-Spirit and queer folk. Like this is what, like, we already have these. We're already witnessing these amazing projects that these youth are doing, and we need to support them and to see that they are happening, and that you know, there's youth in my community that are developing apps to teach the language, and the Nakazali Wetan dialect, and they need our support. Like let's forget about, well, not forget about it. I think we need to think critically and recognize our limitations, and that there does need to be a push to push people to say, we do need to work on these language initiatives. We do need, but let's not forget about the amazing things that are already happening, that are already being built. Don't let them go to the wayside. Support these people doing these amazing projects, and that's what's been kind of the coolest thing about blogs and podcasts and Twitter, is watching kind of
the Indigenous world rise up in front of our eyes, and to see the creativity, the brilliance, the love behind all of this stuff. It's really challenged me to be a better person, and it's been challenged me to be a better academic, to be a better athlete or coach, to be a better person, and to recognize my limitations. And so that's been pretty cool. So when I think of the future, I think it's right in front of us. I think that if we can
just stay on track.
Yeah, and play a small role in this.
I like that.
It's really empowering.
That idea of what you talk about, because when there's Indigenous issues are just so complex, and everyone's always just looking for the end-all, be-all answer that's going to solve all our problems, and so many institutions, or even just government or anything like that, they're just looking for that end-all, be answer, because they just want, it's almost like washing their hands clean of it, right? And that's the thing, is we often get those outside factors. They're getting so much caught up in what's that one answer that they don't even do the small things. And it's those small things, because if we keep doing the small things, at the end, when we finally resolve it, I think that's, if we just keep, like what you're saying is you stay on track, just do those small things, because in the end, maybe it was all the small things led to that. Like, there was no end-all, be-all answer. It was, we needed to do the small things. So what, as a academic, what do institutions need to do more to continue that journey to, don't look for the end-all, be-all answer. What are the small things that you can do to create that legacy, or that create that resurgence in Indigenous students or people?
Yeah, I mean,
or even communities, what can they do, I guess?
I think that here I'm sitting as an academic, and I think it's important that I don't define myself solely based on my occupation, right? And the work I do in communities is actually...
You don't like being known as Dr. Allan Downey?
No, it's like I don't identify as that. And it comes back to those community relations. So ultimately, I think what institutions can do is being accountable to the communities, and being accountable to your local communities specifically, and their forms of nationhood that support that. I want to see Indigenous students that one day are able to walk through an institution's doors and be who they are, and never have that challenged, but only supported. And you can't say that about every institution. These are, at times, can be really violent and oppressive places for Indigenous youth, Indigenous professors, Indigenous staff. That hasn't gone away. And so I want to see a time where you can walk in as an Indigenous youth, and your identity is supported, or it thrives, it flourishes in these spaces. When it comes to there is no one answer, but there's fundamental answers about, there's no it's not prescriptive. Decolonization in this country is not prescriptive, but there are fundamental things we can start discussing, and number one is land. This gives Canadians a panic attack when you start talking about this, and it's like that insecurity, because an insecurity of, maybe there's something off here. Like that, there's actually a legitimate reason to talk about this thing, and there is, right? And this isn't to say that it destroys the relationship, it actually builds it when we start talking about this stuff. It doesn't ask anybody to leave. It just asks for that responsibility, reciprocity, and respect of the relationship that doesn't exist. It does not exist right now. And in my mind, reconciliation will not get us there. The problem with reconciliation at this point in time, as Audra Simpson and many, many others, and community members and activists remind us, and elders have been telling us for years and years and years, and generations of people that stood up to this system of colonialism that Canada implements on Indigenous peoples, is ultimately that we need to talk about land. And it's not asking people to leave. It's not asking for, that's not what it is. It's about a renewed relationship, and fundamentally, structurally, it comes down to land, and then it comes down to the self-determination of Indigenous communities and peoples. And so when we talk about identity, we talked a lot about this yesterday at dinner. And to fill in our kind of audience in this conversation was, what's the answer about this? And it's because you want to get away from the Indian Act, you want to get away from prescribed notions of identity or blood quantum, which is really problematic and super racist. And ultimately, I think that, and I don't have the answers, I never will, and I'm okay being wrong, and that's okay. But ultimately, I think it's the self-determination of Indigenous communities to be able to dictate what that means, right? And I mean each Indigenous community. And so, when Canada says that they have a nation-to-nation relationship, it's just branding. It's not a reality of our lived experiences. It's just the branding of gaining votes. That's the way it works, and that's the way it operates. It just shapeshifts. Colonialism shapeshifts. But when they say they're a nation-to-nation relationship, they have it wrong. What they really mean, or should mean, is nation-to-nations relationship. Your ceremonies are much different. As an Oneida person and a Blackfoot person, your ceremonies are much different than mine. Our languages we can't recognize each other, right? But we can recognize each other's the brilliance in our ceremonies, and we can recognize the brilliance in our philosophies and our worldviews and our culture and our ceremonies and our languages, and we can see that
it's
in each
connecting
other.
those dots, right?
Yeah,
It's connecting
absolutely.
the dots. Like, we may not share like the same language or the same culture, but we could probably go into each other's ceremonies,
Yeah.
connect the dots, and see what that is. And I think it's like when you talk about Indigenous ideologies, it makes non-Indigenous people so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But why does it make them uncomfortable? Because if at the core value of like you not being able to connect the dots is like what we're asking for, we're not trying to be militant and just take everything back, but it's understand where we're coming from, and I think that's the problem with a lot of institutions, and it's just not that ability to understand, or don't even want to bother to understand.
The fun part about teaching at a university is, and particularly at the university I'm at right now, is the majority of people I'm teaching are non-Indigenous students, and they're incredible and they're great. I love the conversations that we're having because they're self-selecting. And this is, I think, also really important. But the students that I'm getting are self-selecting. They're deciding, I want to know more about this, and that's what I think is really cool about youth today and university students and high school students is they're actually being self-reflexive and saying, hey, I want to learn more about this and I don't know a lot. What's this stuff all about? And it's really cool because they sign up for these Indigenous studies classes or Indigenous history classes or Indigenous sociology or Indigenous math classes if they offer them. And so I think that has been really inspiring to see as these students coming into the class, non-Indigenous students and Indigenous students, sitting through and talking through this. But the other thing I say to all my students is, I'm here to make you uncomfortable. That's my job. If you're not uncomfortable, it means you're not stepping outside of your own epistemology, your own worldviews, and into someone else's and getting a glimpse of that. And I mean this to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Like, it's not always comfortable for me. I do Haudenosaunee history. And it's not comfortable to go into a Haudenosaunee community and be like, hey, I'm a historian, I want to talk about lacrosse and do this lacrosse stuff, when they're the experts. What do they need me for? But living through that, being uncomfortable like that, I think is a really, really important process. This is something I learned very early, and I'm really grateful to my family and my dad to kind of teaching me about this, was that being uncomfortable means that you're putting yourself in a position to learn and to realize, to be humble and to know you know nothing. Like, I've been a university professor for a while, and I know nothing. Like, I don't really know much. And so that give and take relationship that I'm seeing in classrooms between Indigenous, non-Indigenous youth and into the young adults, that it's been really inspiring, and it's taught me a lot. It's taught me a lot as an academic, as an individual, as somebody that's kind of trying to devote my life to this Resurgence project and to sharing these stories with community. And I'm learning just as much from my students Indigenous, non-Indigenous, wherever they're coming from, all over the world, as I'm teaching them, and I love that. Like I recognize that. I'm learning from the communities, and I think that as Indigenous people, one of the cool things that we can do, and again, I go back to Leanne Simpson's words on this and ideas, but you know, when we're grounded in our own nationhood, our ability, it just kind of complements our ability then to go to other Indigenous communities and in other Indigenous nations and learn from them, to, you know, be grounded and to identify who I am as DeKelth, but then do talk about Haudenosaunee history and what I've learned, but also being accountable to those communities, but to talk about what I learned from the Haudenosaunee, whether it's going to Longhouse or going to ceremonies or doing youth lacrosse camps. And it's pretty cool to have that experience. And you know, it hasn't always been that way for me, right? We talked about this, but it hasn't always been that way for me because of that insecurity of being a proud Indigenous person and self-identifying that, but not necessarily knowing the complexities and responsibilities of my nationhood that I've now since been working on, like, you know, and devoting my life to. And I hope that you know, we can give that back to communities and youth and to adults that are working their way through this process, like creating these forums to talk about these stuff.
Yeah, I guess for me, it just bringing you here has been a great experience, and having to, you know, be a part of the first part of this venture that we're hopefully doing. And I guess for me, it's always hitting home is that it's that message to Indigenous youth of, we kind of talk about this, like, it's not easy, the journey to get to the point where you have gotten, or even where I've gotten, but it's I always say it's a necessary journey. Because I always see so many youth, and like we're owed so much as Indigenous people, but that's never to say that we're ever gonna get what we're owed. But what is our best way to position ourselves in order to be successful? Like what does Indigenous youth need to do to ensure that they're doing their best to, you know, if they come from a negative situation, to change it into a positive, basically changing their course of family history? What can they do to begin that journey?
Be proud of who they are. It's like, if you're an urban Indigenous youth, I mean, you're going through the experiences of other urban Indigenous youth that are uniquely Indigenous. If you're coming from a community, being proud of where you come from, who you are. You know, we all go through, our families all go through struggles and have gone through struggles, whether it's the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of what's been done, or what is to come. Being proud of who you are, and that's not an easy process. Like that's a process that I've had to go through, and that knowing that your communities are already proud of you. Your community, like, I'm not an inspiration to anyone. I don't see myself as an inspiration to anyone. I don't think I'm doing anything wonderful or great, because my inspiration are those kids, those elders, those knowledge holders that are keeping these fires alive of the ceremonies, the culture, and trying to, you know, under all these obstacles and all these hurdles put in their way, whether it's internal, external, continuing to share these stories, and for youth to reach out. Like, that's such a powerful thing to do, is to recognize that you can be proud of who you are right now. You don't have to wait until tomorrow. But then to turn and to your own communities, or to friendship centers, or to elders in urban context, and know that you belong there. You deserve to be there. I think that's really important. I think those are the people that I turn to and still inspire me. the people doing these really amazing and diverse projects, whether they're like social media projects or media projects, and film and photography or poetry, whatever their passions are. That's the inspiring thing, and that's the thing you can be proud of the most, I think, is who you are and the passions that you follow. I just think that's the really cool thing about the times that we live in right now, is that we have these forums, we have these spaces where Indigenous peoples can proudly proclaim like just how proud they are and who they are, and let's continue to support that.
Beautiful. Can't say anything else. It's great.
Awesome.
Thanks, brother.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me, man.